Hi, I'm Michael. Thank you so much for joining me. I know your time is precious, so the reason why you're here is you might have seen this word information architecture before. This is a subject that is something I'm really passionate about. I actually teach this at Northwestern, and what I wanted to do is to give you an overview of my course and start to get many people to understand how I believe that information architecture and the skills that you can develop in this area are really going to be long lifetime skills. I think I don't think, but I've observed that there's a lot of misunderstanding and trepidation, let's say, about the way computers have invaded so many different jobs, or let's say that you could be replaced by AI. And these are probably true, depending upon the skills that you're selling, and some of the basic skills in terms of communication and writing, for example, with ChatGPT, even developing visual work when it comes to Dolly, are demonstratively done pretty well by a computer. And I think information architecture is going to teach you why. Why can it do that? And also how it isn't at all as impactful. It does creep into some things that I know many of us think are absolutely vitally human, but they're not. So actually, if we go through this, and hopefully I can give you an overview in a few minutes here to give you why is information architecture interesting, and then I'm going to actually take you through the steps needed in subsequent videos that we do actually as part of this coursework, because it's a really fascinating subject. And if you don't know anything about computers, if you're not a designer, stay on board just for a minute, because I don't think that it's a skill set that is 100% about design, which is my background. I'm a designer and I build websites and build experiences and interactions and things like that. That's sort of the one practical way you can use this. But actually, overall, I think if you've worked in any business that is not run by you, and all the information that you gather is not just for you, then the techniques here should be able to help. So that's my pitch. Let's start with a little bit of an overview. So information architecture, this is this layering idea here is fairly interesting and important, because I think this comes from my designer background. A lot of people think everything on the surface is what's important, but actually no, the surface is just that. It's surface. It can be very appealing, it can be somewhat attractive, etc. But it's still a surface, and it comes with some sort of structures underneath. And these structures underneath begin to be some of the things we're going to tease out a bit, but that underlying structure and skeleton are really, again, they're much more generic. In most interactions that you're going to have on the web, just like viewing this video, you don't have to think too much about it, but you did have to think quite a lot about it a while back, right? When these are being developed, there wasn't all these things had not been figured out yet. Right now, I think we're in a great time, which is why it's a little bit threatening, that things are fairly good, they're fairly easy to use, and conventionally, you can do a lot of powerful things with your devices. Good stuff. But as I said, that scope and strategy part, I think for anyone in terms of business, in terms of, nothing's more important than strategy, right? Which is, what are you trying to achieve? How does it connect to people's goals? Or some people call it jobs to be done. How do you connect with people's insights? That strategy is really important before you can build upon all the rest. So I'll just put it also to give you one more contextual thing. As you are learning about design, you can be in the world of anthropology or user research, understanding people, understanding how they interact or what their goals may be. That gives you contextual inquiry is really great, where you can just watch people do things. And that's a lot of times when it comes to how people interface with physical spaces plus digital ideas. If you've ever pulled out your phone at the grocery store, for example, people study that quite a bit, of how do you get online and offline experiences to gel together to be something interesting or important. Information architecture is that you can take those two inputs and really start to build these structures, so that architecture word is not wrong. It is about kind of building and actually learning what things you might need in order to create architecture. And the way you understand whether you're right or not is you want to get people involved, and people like stories and they like prototypes, which are just things you can actually interact with. And that gives you insight. Hey, did I actually get to the right point? And you'll test those things and you'll use those in order to repeat over and over. You might not repeat every one of these elements. You might not start back at research after testing. So if you're involved in any sort of world where there's the word agile or scrum or things like that, it's always about iteration and having sort of quick cycles so that people can learn. Ideally. So why and what is this idea of information architecture? It comes from the most incredible invention one can imagine, really, nowadays. We have this wheel and we have engines and alternating current, and also, there's some great stuff. I'm paraphrasing, but it's hypertext. And what is that? Why is that important? What? Oh, you mean I can have a word, and within this kind of artificial environment, I can click on that word and I can go to a different page, a different context, a different everything just by clicking. So instead of so many of the ways that people used to gather information, this hyperlink thing it was such a game changer, right? When it came about, I don't think anyone really knew what to do with it, so they invented some terms around it, which is, well, how do you manage what people can click on? How does clicking help you engage or focus your goals when there's a whole lot of content? So that's where it came from. It came from the hyperlink. And if you wonder what do you really do as an information architect, I think my glib answer is you make lists. Seems easy enough, right? We make lists all the time. There's unordered lists, which is stuff. Well, let's just say there's stuff, and then there's lists of stuff, and then there's ordered lists of stuff. So stuff might be, for example, if you look at your any of your computing environments, traditional ones, you might see this concept of a desktop that has stuff on it. Great metaphor, not a really great user experience because it tends to be cluttered. It tends to have, it's not very useful to anyone but you, which in fact is fine. But it doesn't really leverage a lot of the power of what computers can do pretty easily and what people do poorly sometimes, which is organized. So you're going to be organized. So making a list. Budgeting, anytime you're trying to classify things or make something make some sense in a list, that's really all you do. And so there you go. That's why almost anyone can at least hopefully interact with or engage with this kind of idea. And the reason, again, it's really important, and I think it is coming up, is that there's going to be a lot more information. Just because ChatGPT can write a good piece of content doesn't mean that you can find a willing reader for that content. And in fact, if the reader is you, wonderful. You can have that's why they call it ChatGPT. You can chat with the computer. And yeah, that actually goes all the way back to a Turing test. If you've ever heard of a Turing test, it's the inventor of modern computing, let's call it. He said if you can have a conversation with a computer and you think it is a person, you win the Turing test. You have to be human, however. You have to convey humanness. I don't think ChatGPT is necessarily there, but we'll see. Yeah, we'll see how it goes. It's all is new. Anyway, so there's also the idea of information that is overload, and it really has to do with if you know every possible angle of a situation, you might find the information analysis paralysis. You might just be unable to make a decision, and really decision making is something really fairly important to most people, and it's why we use a lot of this is in order to decide things. So I've got this pyramid because I like this concept of a pyramid. It starts with there's lots of, and every step above that is something that adds more value. There's less of it, right? So this pyramid is a bit of my own creation. I don't think there's that much, let's call too original about it, but I'll go walk through it. We'll start at the bottom. There's data, and there's lots of that. We just talked about the desktop. Let's pretend all the files on your desktop is a data set, which means, hey, here's a bunch of stuff. And if you're a mathematician or interested in math, there's set theory, which is sets are just things that you put in a set. So cool, very useful. Also, it's a big topic, and it's something that helps people make sense of large amounts of things. So anyway, there's lots of it. So just remember when we talk about data that we're not always talking about numbers and spreadsheets and all that kind of thing. We're talking about images, sets of images, anything to do with text, really, videos, songs, and any sort of digital media. Certainly beginning with text, but then moving into all these other realms. And now we consider almost everything, I suppose, to have some digital aspect to it, right? You can digitalize a lot of data, so much of it, right? So great, lots of it. And we'll get into how do you deal with that. That's the very first place we'll begin as an information architect, which is dealing with data. But what about a step up from there? Well, this is where I think that this is why most of you can engage in, and I think can even get interested in from your own personal background, is pattern recognition. So above data is things that have been recognized as having a pattern. And patterns are very human. It's something that we are actually very proud of. That's something we do. We recognize patterns. In fact, if you've ever done an optical illusion, we might recognize patterns, visual patterns, for example, that are incorrect. They're just hacking the way your brain thinks. And we can talk, and I love to talk actually about Gestalt theory, which is a way that you have been able to organize, create a set around different kinds of ways you can do visual information. But let's say pattern recognition could also be verbal. It could be songs, like genres. So anyway, there's some pattern to something. So people, and without a doubt, this is absolutely human, is we can't ever deal with the absolute massive flood of information that gets into us every moment. And without pattern recognition, it's the way we ignore almost everything, which is perfect, because otherwise we'd be fried, right? So pattern is a uniquely human thing. What is troubling to most people is that computers are getting much better at pattern recognition. And that is troubling because, let's say, for example, our ability that we learned very early on to recognize faces, understanding and recognizing different facial structures is really important to people. However, we've only seen certain kinds of faces. Maybe you live in a more cosmopolitan place and have seen many, many different, but still you have not seen every face, whereas computers can take those data sets of faces and actually start to see patterns that we would maybe never humanly recognize. We might recognize a friend of ours, but again, the computer can almost do a better job of that now. And it's going to get better at almost everything. It's better at recognizing things like driving along a road. You would think that that would be a uniquely human thing to be able to drive a car, but when you really think about it, it's really just a lot of pattern recognition, right? And it's probably also why we don't use a ton of cognitive power while driving, because you don't have a lot. You may. Indeed, when you're early on in driving, you're overwhelmed by how much is going on. But after a while, you go, well, there's only certain things that are going on and certain things that deserve attention. Computers, again, can probably do that fairly well now, right? They can certainly recognize things like streets and so on and so forth. So anyway, patterns. Terrific. But it's still one step above data. And you can see this pattern is going to keep going to information. And information is where it is going to be harder for computers to compete, because information has to do with context. And right now, the context, for example, if you're doing a chat GPT or something, the context is going to be maybe the questions that you're asking. However, the computer doesn't know why you're asking. It doesn't inquire as to what the purpose is. It doesn't have some of the inner things that we do pretty well or do extremely poorly and make everybody around us mad by missing the context, becoming saying things that are inappropriate or all these things, or humor, for example, I think is going to be really tough for a computer because they're so contextually important. So there you go. So once all that data gets sort of organized into something meaningfully, it's kind of like made some sense. Maybe there's one, or maybe there's a bunch of them, turns into information, which you could look at as almost maybe a nice analog is like a newspaper, a good old physical newspaper, right? It's a bunch of information. It has a context, and normally that is described somehow, or at least you get the context of, hey, it happened today because it's in a newspaper. Newspapers probably don't talk about something perhaps that's 50 years old. I'm a big fan of, and many of you are too, of the New Yorker. I think the difference between the New Yorker and a blog are very interesting because once you go online, a lot of context gets ruined, right? And this is where you're going to spend a lot of your efforts in information architecture, is making sure those contexts are pretty good and understood and make sense. Moving up. So again, once you get to information, which is hard, and I think it's pretty good that saying computers will not threaten this layer too quickly, but even worse is knowledge. And knowledge comes from being trustworthy or actionable. Pretty good stuff, right? Like, now this is, of course, where people are constantly fooled. You're fooled even by optical illusions, right? Are things trustworthy that you can see? Well, not all the time. Are people trustworthy? Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. So, for example, anyway, so it's someone taking a piece of information and presenting it as knowledge. That is, pretty good, and it's pretty rare because hopefully there isn't a complete automatic trust, although I think as humans we have learned that trusting other people is usually to our benefit. So we tend to, if someone says it to you, it's trustworthy. If you see it or read it, well, your mileage may vary. But either way, so now you're moving up the pyramid. Can you create knowledge with information architecture? Absolutely. I will demonstrate how you're going to do it. And it's a little more difficult than you think, but you experience it all the time. But let's go to the best one of all is wisdom, because when you hear wisdom, it can actually change your mind. So where I go with this course is, and this is very aspirational, but this is where I want to end up and start having dialogues about how do you create wisdom? Because you're still going to start with data. I mean, there's no way around it. You're going to have tons of it. You're going to keep sifting it, so forth, sort of like wheat being turned into flour, being turned into bread, being turned into nourishment, and then becoming, let's call it the best bread you've ever had. I don't know. There's something that raises it up, right? It's something to do with, something that medicine might be like that. There's tons of experiments. Somehow or another, you're sifting through until you can reach this thing, which is a cure. So there's so many different ways to apply this pyramid, and the information architecture techniques will and should help you at least understand each layer, and hopefully my main goal is to help you transform things. And that transformation, whether you want to call it design, whether you want to just call it being clever, is what humans can be good at. They can really be good at transformation of things that are not valuable into something valuable. So I think that gives you an overview and the biggest picture, and I will get into the details. Please join me in the next video. Thank you so much for your attention.